These farmers in County Kerry are the descendants of men who were tenants on the estates of landlords. Even the largest tenant farmers couldn't claim to be secure from high rent increases or eviction.
Pin 2, sorry, this. Pin 2. Okay. Very good.
And when the potato blight struck again and threatened another famine in 1878, a movement emerged determined to protect the farmers from eviction.
The great movement for change would be built around the forefathers of men like these. The rural poor would be mobilised into a force that sparked phenomenal social change and created a political legend. It would be led by two men as different from each other as it was possible to be in background and personality.
In 1879, a 31-year-old activist, Michael Davitt, returned to his native County Mayo after spending 7 years in British prisons for his part in a Fenian plot. Davitt had come back to Mayo to rally farmers threatened with eviction, and because he saw in the rural crisis the chance to put his own socialist ideas into practice.
Davitt was born in 1846 at the height of the famine. At the age of 4, Davitt, his 3 sisters and his parents were evicted from their homestead in County Mayo. The family were forced in 1850 to emigrate to England. And all throughout his childhood, Davitt was brought up with these images.
And isn't the key thing that he grows up profoundly shaped by radical ideas of English socialism?
Yes, that's true. In fact, his experiences would have been more in tune with the industrial working class of Lancashire. For him, that relationship between them and the landlord was no different from a relationship between the industrial boss and the industrial worker.
Davitt was a child of the Industrial Revolution and at the age of 11 had lost his right arm in a mill accident. Yet this class warrior would form an alliance with an aristocrat. Charles Stewart Parnell came from a Protestant landowning family whose fortunes had declined after the famine. From his American mother, he'd inherited a strong anti-British sentiment, and he would become a nationalist icon.
Parnell and Davitt are fascinating contrast in almost every way you can think. Parnell, an aristocrat, a dictator, as he was well known as. He even called one of his horses Dictator. Davitt, a socialist who becomes increasingly socialist with the years. But out of those differences came, I think, a great deal of the strength of that astonishing decade of roughly 1880 to 1890, when such political success seemed to be within the grasp of the Irish nationalist movement.
Davitt admired Parnell's willingness to confront the government. The vehicle that would bring both men to the forefront of nationalist politics was the Irish Land League, which began from October 1879 to organise civil disobedience against increased rents and evictions. One of the first cases taken up by the League was that of a tenant farmer in Lunamore, County Mayo. Anthony Dempsey had fallen behind on his rent and faced eviction. These are relatives of Anthony Dempsey visiting his old cottage.
Thousands of people gathered here to prevent the eviction of the Dempsey family. The biggest significance of it was that Charles Stewart Parnell came to this scene.
So he would have come up the road, down over that way,
yeah,
and come up. Thousands of people.
Yeah. We're led to believe that Parnell came up the hill there on a white horse.
Now, is that kind of well, the Irish gift for romanticising things, or did it really happen?
I don't know, but it would have added to the whole occasion if it did happen.
Because that's how people saw him.
Yes,
wasn't it?
Yes, yes.
I mean, there's truth in that. They saw him as the knight riding to rescue.
Yes, when the police realised the major in charge called off the eviction at that particular time.
Vast sums of money were raised through the Fenian networks in America and used to subsidise evicted families. The League was both rural trade union and nationalist movement. A rent strike was declared. The League tapped into rural traditions of coercion against those it called the people's enemies.
The Land League develops a new tactic called boycotting, or social ostracism. One of the other aspects of this was what became known as moonlighting, where those who went against the unwritten law would be visited at night or would receive letters or warnings about their conduct, and even to have mock funerals, kind of symbolise the end of them as members of the community.
But transformation in Ireland is dependent on a parallel but very different revolution in Britain. It is the age of mass industrialisation and rapid social change. In this evolving United Kingdom, dominated by the forces of industry, the old Ireland of landlords seems out of step with the spirit of the age. Politics too was changing. The vote had been extended to factory and farm workers. Parnell's Irish Party benefited from a new secret ballot, which undermined the power of landlords to coerce their tenants into voting for them. Irish nationalists were a force in Parliament.
The struggle for land rights now moved to the Houses of Parliament, and it would take the energy and vision of a British Prime Minister to introduce legislation that would have a more far-reaching, practical impact on the lives of rural communities than any other statute in the past century.
William Ewart Gladstone was a combination of moralist and canny politician. In 1881 he introduced a Land Act which offered Irish tenants security from eviction and a means of controlling their rent. After further agitation, Gladstone moved closer to meeting the key demand of David and Parnell, the right of Irish tenants to buy their own land.
I think there's a strong argument for saying that the hinge on which modern Irish history turns is the Land War of 1879 to 1882. From 1881 through to the Land Acts of the early 20th century, you have the British state enabling Irish tenants to buy out their holdings from the landlords and become small peasant proprietors, as the phrase of the day would have it. This has immense implications for the creation of a conservative, with a small c, rural petit bourgeoisie. The social revolution that begins with the Land War isn't the creation of a socialist state, as David would have wanted, but it turned out to be a conservative revolution, which is exactly what Charles Stewart Parnell would have liked.
There has been a long social revolution. The laws which forced Catholics and Presbyterians to pay for the upkeep of the Anglican Church have already been overturned. It was now no longer the state church. The Protestant ascendancy was being dismantled not by violent revolution, but by acts of a British Parliament. The Catholic bourgeoisie of farmers, merchants and professionals were the rising force, and their church, already powerful, would come to dominate Irish life well into the modern age. In the new confident church, Cardinal Paul Cullen had emerged as a princely figure. He was ordained the same year that Catholic emancipation was granted, and rose to become Archbishop of Dublin and Ireland's first cardinal.
Cullen set a mark on Irish Catholicism which was there until very, very recently. He set up an institutional framework. The orphanages, the schools, the churches, the confraternities, all the paraphernalia, if you like, of Catholic life. His era was also hugely influential in shaping the personal and public piety of the Irish.
There's a pretty fierce attempt to control the Catholic population on the part of Cullen and the kind of men who came along with him.
His interest is the security, the rights and the position of the church, and he will be as tough as he needs to be to secure those Catholic interests.
The story of the 19th century in Ireland is one in which power shifts decisively. The great issues of religious freedom, of land, have now been confronted. But there remains the most divisive question of all: Home Rule. Up to now, Ireland has been ruled from London. But the campaign to change that will lead to the division that persists in Ireland to this very day. The new campaign will be led by the hero of the Land League, Charles Stewart Parnell. Under Home Rule, Ireland would stay in the Empire. But it would be ruled not from London, but Dublin, and by a nationalist-dominated parliament. By 1885, Parnell was in a strong bargaining position. His party now held the balance of power in Parliament, and he found Gladstone a willing partner.
This deeply religious man was beginning to see Ireland as a divine mission and Home Rule as a means of repaying the Irish for the cruelties of the past. And there was a pragmatic consideration. Gladstone needed the support of Parnell's MPs to keep his government in power. For moral and political reasons, Ireland mattered as never before.
By 1886, Gladstone was ready to put a Home Rule bill before the House of Commons.
Parnell and his MPs listened intently as Gladstone declared that this was a golden moment, which rarely returns. The British Prime Minister had placed his political prestige and the formidable weight of his oratory behind self-rule for the Irish. But it wouldn't be enough.
The bill was defeated by 30 votes. Many of Gladstone's own Liberal supporters, fearful that Home Rule could lead to the breakup of the Empire, voted against him. In Ireland, the bill raised sectarian tension. Many Ulster Protestants saw Home Rule as simple Rome Rule. On the day the bill was defeated, there were riots in Belfast.
Here at Alexandra Dock, a rumour spread that Catholics had attacked an Orangeman. Soon, hundreds of shipyard workers were streaming across the road. They set about the Catholics, beating them with whatever came to hand. The Catholic workers, some of them jumped into the water, trying to swim across the river. One man was drowned. By nightfall, rioting had spread across Belfast.
Gladstone took an extremely myopic view, I think it has to be said, of Ulster resistance, in which he was accompanied by Parnell, who simply took the line that Ulster had played a grand part in the 1798 Rising and platonically was part of nationalist Ireland, and these deluded unionists would come and see this in time.
As news of the defeat of Home Rule spread through the streets of Belfast, Protestants in working class areas came out to celebrate. They marched behind orange bands and they lit bonfires. As the smoke curled up into the sky, it could have been read as a warning of an age of violence and division that was to come. Parnell and Gladstone were to make one more attempt at bringing about Home Rule. In December 1889, Parnell travelled to Harden Castle in Flintshire, Gladstone's country home. The Irish party leader came here to meet Gladstone as the year ended, and the possibility of a great new campaign for Home Rule bubbled in the air, until calamity descended. It was the biggest sex scandal of its time. Parnell's nearly decade-long liaison with a married woman, Catherine O'Shea, became public when her husband, from whom she was separated, sued for divorce. Her husband was one of Parnell's MPs. Victorian opinion was scandalised by false stories about Parnell donning disguises and fleeing down a fire escape. His party would now be confronted with a stark choice by the Prime Minister. Gladstone realised that the forces ranged against Parnell were simply too powerful. And within his own party, the voices of the morally affronted were growing louder. He wrote to the Irish Parliamentary Party that if Parnell were to remain as its leader, his own position as leader of the Liberals would become impossible. In this way, Gladstone cut Parnell loose.
But Parnell would not step down, even after his former allies, the Catholic bishops, denounced him. At a bitter meeting in Westminster, he faced his MPs. Parnell placed his leadership before the unity of the party, and it split. The majority deserted him. He returned to Ireland to campaign, facing often hostile crowds. His health worsened, and he was dead within a year.
Parnell's fall and destruction was a kind of classic tale of hubris. He was a titanic figure, but the flaws in his personality were part of that titanic image, that kingly hauteur. When he fought his last campaigns, one of his tactics was to pour scorn on the very thing that he himself had accomplished. He was now saying, look, it would never have happened. Never trust the British. He is reverting to an older Fenian-style kind of rhetoric, where Britain represents the infamous thing that you can never trust, that will always do down Ireland. He's saying, now they've done down me. He had done himself down.
Vast crowds attended Parnell's Dublin funeral. A star has been laid low, wrote the poet W.B. Yeats.